Well, you know what? Let's go up right now. Let's talk about something that is a fun topic that I'm sure you'll enjoy talking about. WWE biography this past weekend on A&E had what may be, well, I think what definitely is the best biography of this season,
Yeah.
but it may be the best one they've done so far. I remember they did a good Bret Hart one, and there's been a few other ones. But the Dusty Rhodes biography aired this past weekend, Jim.
Yeah, and this was the best one, I think, of all of them. Not only because they did such a as thorough a job as you could do for a career like that in 2 hours, but also it was not only informative, it was not only well done, but it was fun to watch for once. It was fun. There were sad parts, but overall you came out smiling out of the thing. It wasn't like it checked all the boxes for me. And I mean, before we talk about the program in with any specificity as far as what was in it, just the footage and the pictures of Dusty at any point in his career, especially because they've got the Florida Library, they had so much good stuff there. But they had the McGurk TV studio with Reeser Bout. No, not Ray. It was Boyd Pierce introducing Dusty Rhodes and Dick Murdoch, the Outlaws, and all the old pictures and clippings that obviously they got from the family and great research. The whole thing is it showed his emotion, the passion, the energy, the charisma. Whether it was the promos had the cadence and the delivery and the inflection. And because he could go from goofiness to melodrama in the same promo, but you believed it because everything came with sincerity. And when he was making goofy faces and saying goofy things, it wasn't because he was acting goofy. I've lived through this era, not in Florida, but just when Dusty was young and getting over. And a lot of the fans just said they believed he was goofy, not that he was acting goofy. That fucking goofy Dusty is like he's like my cousin fucking Virgil or whatever. Except then
Virgil, of all the names?
Well, I'm just saying, I'm making that up. But people would say, like, I know a guy like him, or yeah, he's like my fucking boss, or he's like my goddamn cousin or a guy I went to school with. He's goofy like that. But they believed he was goofy, and then he could turn it on and be an ass kicker rather than he was acting goofy. They didn't know about gimmicks. They didn't know what the fuck. Dusty could make you believe him. And whatever. I've talked about Gunther being a perfect wrestler because he never does anything in the ring that he really shouldn't do, even when he's with guys that don't fit him stylistically. Dusty could get away with all that shit, but he never said shit that Dusty wouldn't say, or in a different way otherwise than what Dusty would say it. Do you see what I mean? He knew what he could get away with. He had the funky side and he had the serious side and the vowing vengeance side, and then doing an interview with a fucking gorilla. Yeah, I got a fucking gorilla here. It all worked for him because it was him. It was real. And you see the people, the pictures in. There's a famous picture from Detroit when he won the Sheik's U.S. I don't know if he beat the Sheik for it, but he won the U.S. title that was the old Sheik belt with the United States fucking shaped plate on the front of it. And there's all the fans at the Cobo have jumped up on the apron of the ring and they're holding him. It may have been Brad McFarlane. It may have been Brian Buchanan. I don't know who took this picture. But there's black kids and there's white kids and there's young blonde teenage girls and they're all reaching for him and hugging him. And you saw pictures like that when he won they had the footage of him beating Harley for the title in 1979. And they sent the baby faces in the ring for a celebration, but then the people fucking jump up there and they're overwhelmed with the ring's overwhelmed with the fans. They were joyous about it because that's how much they got into him. And
there was footage, not to jump ahead, but there was footage of one match from Florida, him and Ernie Ladd.
Yes.
And the people were losing their shit, and I was getting into it. I wish it wasn't so clipped, of just Ernie selling for the elbow.
That's the thing, is you see the people going crazy, and a lot of it was the footage with, not to get ahead, but Billy Graham in Madison Square Garden. Those people were jumping up and down. They loved Billy Graham. Remember, at the time, Billy Graham was the most popular heel champion they'd ever had. They loved him in New York. He sold out every time he defended. But they loved Dusty and the fucking wiggle and the walk and the strut and the jive and think about this. They had been fed a diet of pretty straight-laced fucking baby faces in terms of Bruno and Pedro, pretty clear-cut baby face people that straight ahead fight with honor type of thing. And that's why they reacted to Graham with the patter and the body and the promo and the whole night. But then they get Dusty and he's talking, and even did you hear the clip when Vince Jr., as the announcer in 1977, was interviewing Dusty? He was trying to do Dusty. He was trying to be funky. He said, "It's the American dream." He was almost imitating Dusty, the man that's funky.
That is one of those words that Vince fell in love with. Vince fell in love with the word funky around there, because every now and then, years later, you would just hear like, funky, like just on one of the shows.
But even though that's the generation right before you as a fan, you as a historian know that it had been pretty straight-laced with the baby faces in the Northeast to that point. And then here comes Dusty and talking like that and looking like that and doing all that bullshit. And people loved it. So
yeah, my dad had a friend who always talked about, a friend who would come over and watch, baseball, basketball, football with my dad. But he would go on his own to the Garden in the 70s, as he always said, to see Dusty Rhodes.
Well, and that was 1977. Dusty was still in Florida. And of course, they went through, well, not to skip over this program completely, but they covered his early years. The debut in Dallas program I love, but I'm trying, was it Dusty that, I don't think he just walked right in the Sportatorium, or was it the Sportatorium where he basically bluffed his way into business by telling him that he'd been trained when he hadn't? And then he kind of got his foot in the door and got booked.
Well, remember, he went to West Texas State, so he is already very familiar with wrestlers, or families of wrestlers.
That's why I'm saying, I think he went somewhere and dropped some names, and okay. But anyway, they had his brother Larry is cool as shit, isn't he?
Yeah, and he looks nothing like Dusty, because there was a picture of them, must be from 25 years ago. You figure, oh, maybe back then they looked alike. And there's Dusty and there's Larry with long, dark hair.
Yeah, no, never looked anything alike. But
really cool guy, though.
And Dave Zirin, who they identified as the sports editor of The Nation, may be the best non-wrestling personality talking head they've ever had.
I thought that guy did a great job, and I'm very critical of every one of these goofs they usually wheel out on these shows. This guy did a good job, a really good job.
Yes, and knowledgeable and insightful and added to the program. I think that's the first time I've ever said that about anybody of the talking head variety. And they, like I said, they had some, footage of Rhodes and Murdoch, the Texas Outlaws, the clip of the bar scene from The Wrestler. Did you know that the Midnight Express went 30 minutes Broadway for the NWA World Tag Team title with the Texas Outlaws in Chicago one time?
I did not know that. 30 minutes, really?
In 1988, that fucking the 5 weeks between 6 weeks between when Tully and Arn quit and dropped the belts to us, and then Dusty turned the Road Warriors heel to replace Tully and Arn with another heel team. We were the World Tag Team Champions. And remember, I'd been managing Dick Murdoch, and then he switched babyface to help Dusty.
In 87.
And, this was 88.
No, you managed him in 87.
Oh, well, yeah, yes. Okay, I'm sorry. But anyway, so Dusty, I just booked it one time, I guess for old time's sake. So he and Dick could team for us to defend the belts, because we weren't technically full babyfaces at that point. And Dusty and Dick were, and in Chicago, where they had worked in the AWA. Then we got there, and I guess he realized, well, I don't want to beat the Texas Outlaws in Chicago, even if it's Midnight Express,
Of course.
but I don't want to go an hour. So he had us go 30 minutes Broadway for the World Tag Title.
Was Murdoch into it that night?
Yeah, well, yes, because he liked, the Midnight. He liked me, and I mean, he was having fun. The house was only, as I recall, about 65 grand, so that was, not anything to write home about. But we had a fun match. It was a house show match, not taped or anything.
But a match like that, could Dusty have fun? With all the backstage drama that was happening with Crockett Promotions and the impending Turner sale and Arn and Tully leaving, which ties into both of those things, was he able to go in the ring and have a good time and leave all that behind?
Yes. I mean, and again, it's not like that they were, fucking taking every bump that they did as the Texas Outlaws as heels, blah, blah, blah. He was having more fun at that point than working hard, but it was still a fun match because it was Dusty Rhodes and Dick Murdoch. Anyway, but Cody did a wonderful job in this, I thought. Again, the montage of promo clips. And I understand when they've done the biographies of the modern era guys, that they have the names that most of the viewing audience remembers these days, and the Austins and Undertakers and whatever. But when you be able to go back and just dig deep in some of the Florida and Georgia clips and finally have a guy that was, because there are no promo clips from the Attitude Era. There's clips of in-ring interviews and things, but there's no just the one-liners and the selling the thing and the hyping the thing. And I think Dave Zirin was one of the guys that made mention of, and they had another young lady that was an author, is how she was identified. But Dusty, it was like music, the flow of it, the black church service promo, where he was preaching to people, and he kind of took some shit from Thunderbolt Patterson.
Yeah, he gave him credit. They actually show Thunderbolt here, and that looked beautiful, that clip.
And you're talking about the restored video, not the fact that Thunderbolt was that attractive of a man. But
certainly not. The restored video.
Yes. And also, again, there's Hulk Hogan. Everybody with Flair put him over, called Dusty over, called him a genius. And Hogan's putting him over in his own way, but he's got to bring himself into it. He's like, see that when I raised the finger, brother, the one finger up in the air that was Dusty Rhodes all day long. I saw that when I was 9 years old. And somebody pointed out on Twitter that Hogan was like fucking 17 when Dusty was turned babyface doing the finger or whatever the fuck.
9 years old. Get out of here.
Yeah. And of course, and Cousin Bruce, the Artful Dodger, had to get his Dusty Rhodes impersonation in. And then I loved the music video again, the action stuff in the ring. They can't judge a book by looking at the cover video. I remember seeing that years ago. I'm talking 40 fucking years ago. And all that Florida action, and there's where you're with Ernie Ladd, and there was, I think, Cyclone Negro in there, and the stuff with Pac Song. And, again, more pictures.
Although they didn't show the turn. I was surprised because they referenced the Pac Song Nam feud, but they didn't show the actual moment he turned on, or they turned on Dusty, Gary Hart, and Pac Song.
Well, but I think then not only would that have required them to set it up properly, would have required them to take about a 10-minute detour and explain the strife that had been going on, even that Dusty was a heel, but the people were starting to like him, and there was the trouble in the Gary Hart army, and then Eddie Graham stepped in and led the people the way they were going to begin with, and then the footage of the turn would have been they were kicking a shit out of Dusty, and he was laying there bleeding. He wasn't really shining. But you could tell that Dusty had, in the sit down that they had done with him several years ago, that they included also, he had probably told the story in more detail, and then they clipped it like that. But you got the general gist of the thing. The American Dream began as the counterpoint to the Korean Assassin. I wish T.C. Lee would have got some credit.
It is interesting, though, that, they talked about Dusty's way of speaking and how it was a way to connect beyond white or black. Everyone kind of connected with that guy. Then you had Gary Hart, who was kind of the opposite end of that. I thought Gary Hart was black when I was a kid.
Yeah.
By that point, he was bald. And I thought because of the way he spoke and he seemed like he could be black, I thought he was black. So you have him and Dusty going back and forth on promos. That really must have been something.
Well, and Gary was, even when he was in Charlotte, Gary was a tanner. So he was always tan. And in Florida, you could imagine. And he had that way of speaking because he grew up, and we've talked about Gary's background before, where he grew up in Chicago, was an inner city part of town, and he actually worked alongside with, occasionally for, the fucking connected people, and also had a heavily African-American influence in his neighborhood, and he came up with that way of speaking. Just it was his, and he didn't really magnify it on the air. He just tried to sound a little more menacing than Uncle Gary would sound in the locker room, but he had the, "Would you like some corn, brother?" But anyway, and obviously juxtaposing all of the in-ring stuff and the professional stuff, they were telling a story of, he, again, like a lot of the guys, he had a family early and a family later. His first two kids were Dustin and Kristen, and he wasn't there as much for them because that was the territory days. That's when he was on the road, and ended up getting divorced from his first wife. And then met Michelle, who is his second wife. Obviously, she was involved in heavily in this. She did a great job too. Isn't she just fantastic at speaking in such a way that the people knew what she was saying, but you didn't have to be a real wrestling nerd. Like when she said, instead of saying Dusty wanted to be a booker, she said Dusty always wanted to produce wrestling. And everybody could understand that. So, but anyway, they got a nice shot of the flip-flop and fly-in on Bobby Eaton. I remember that match. That was during the 86 Bash tour somewhere. And,
without directly saying it, they kind of did, but they indirectly alluded to the fact that he turned down Vince before Vince went with Hulk Hogan.
Well, that's where I was going to go next, is that they kind of told the story, but didn't. Maybe somebody did tell it and they clipped it that way, where it's not they never said it nor denied it, that Vince was going to go with Dusty if Hogan had not been there, or Dusty got obviously Vince had liked Dusty so much in 77. And Vince and Eddie Graham had that relationship that we've talked about many times. We talked about the Graham brothers. We talked about Vince Sr. in the old days of the WWF. And Dusty had been in Florida, where he was the hottest attraction that they'd had since Eddie Graham in the 60s. And obviously 20 years later, Florida's so much bigger. Dusty was the hottest ever. And he was drawing him huge money, but at the same time, he had become an attraction on Superstation TBS. Eddie Graham wanted his top guy in Florida to be one of the biggest stars in the entire business. He'd send him to Georgia to work the Omni and to talk on TBS, and he'd send him out for limited shots with the WWF. Remember, Kevin Sullivan said that Eddie's philosophy, once that Dusty was so over, was you got to send him out sometimes so you can get somebody else in Florida over while he's gone, because nobody can get over Dusty. And he'd do that, and he was making Dusty a valuable commodity, but since Eddie was still so powerful in the NWA, he knew he was based there, and he wasn't going to burn out his golden goose. And then he gave Dusty the book down there, did he not? For the first run that Dusty was a booker, he booked Florida for a period of time with Eddie, right?
Well, remember, the interesting thing is, to this period of time, 1983, Dusty's booking Florida. Vince is setting everything up to go national. Dusty still makes dates at the Garden, so the connection's still there. Vince Sr., and not everyone realized Vince Sr. wasn't in charge anymore. In fact, most people didn't, at least until the summer of 83. But Vince Sr. and Eddie Graham still have a good relationship. Florida TV's still airing in New York. They get J.J. Dillon on a Garden show as late as, I think, May of 84. But Dusty, it's an interesting thing to think that if he was presented with the two options, the way they presented it here, of go to the WWF, Vince Jr. is going to try to go national, you'll be his top star, or leave Florida to become the producer or the booker for Jim Crockett Promotions, and you finally get to do what you'll never have an opportunity to do in the WWF. It's interesting that you'd never hear it just put that way. And at that same time, Bill Watts was starting to use Dusty on TV too, so who knows what he was talking about with Watts.
But think about that decision. That's kind of very similar to a decision that Cody had to make a year or so ago, wasn't it? When you think about it, in some respects,
and he went the other way.
Well, but the thing is, do you go with what you always wanted to do, or do you go with what may be a safer proposition where you're already established?
But I don't know if Cody always wanted to do that the way Dusty did. That's my point.
No, Cody always wanted to go back and win the title in the Garden for his daddy.
Yeah.
It was the same type of decision, just not in the same direction. And that's the thing, is that Dusty had fed the idea for Starrcade to Crockett. We know that. That's how he got the booking job, because during the Great Slaughter and Kernodle against Steamboat. I'm sorry, Ricky. Steamboat.
That was
and
when he
Youngblood.
gained weight. Yes.
Oh, quit. He's never gained weight. Steamboat and Youngblood feud. The bookers were Dory and goddamn, they had the 3-state deal going on. Was Ernie Ladd booking one state? Dory was booking one state, and
Gary Hart
was booking this North and South Carolina and Virginia. They split them up, but nevertheless, Dusty had the idea for Starrcade, a mega show in the center of the Carolinas territory, based on how they drew for that, incredible cage match that blew off that tag team program. And Dusty always saw and Closed Circuit. I mean, Dusty, admits that he was influenced by Muhammad Ali. So he saw boxing, Closed Circuit. Cody, everybody else said Dusty saw wrestling as a movie, as cinema. So he didn't want to just do the big house show. This was before pay-per-view. He wanted to do the big TV show that you got paid for. And that launched, Starrcade and Crockett Promotions going into... Crockett had 3 eras before 74, 75, before George Scott came in and they decided to change the tone of the territory after the whole thing with Jim Crockett Sr. had died and John Ringley committed professional suicide. They had been in just a small time but steady, consistent, tag team-oriented territory with the same regional stars, running and drawing incredibly well in most of the small buildings and a few of the big buildings. And then from 74, 75 to 83, they had expanded their own TV truck, running all the bigger buildings in the towns now. And the fucking late 70s boom with Flair and Valentine and Andersons and Piper and Steamboat and etc. But they were still a big regional territory. But now he's seeing the opportunity. They've got their own TV truck. This was before TBS came along, that Crockett was on TBS, but Dusty was already able to be on TBS because of the level of star he was. And as well, Georgia and the Carolinas had always worked together because they were next door to each other, and because Ole Anderson a lot of times booking one or both, and there was a natural synergy. So I think at that point, Dusty saw, my God, and he's big, and he's the biggest star in Florida. He's huge in Atlanta. He's been intermittently to the Carolinas, but not that much. But if he goes in as the booker, he's brand new and fresh. He figured he can take over in one fell swoop the entire Southeast and be the booker and the top babyface for the only company that's on the level to challenge Vince McMahon. He had to take that.
You've always been the biggest public proponent of Dusty's booking, even when there are things that you can't avoid talking about because there were mistakes, at least the way things look nowadays. You've always been the
Yes.
person to point to the positives and talk about
Well,
the
and
good things.
I don't cover up the dusty finish being done 3 times in a row in Greensboro and all that other stuff, but for people not to focus on the fact that it only dropped that far because he got it that high to begin with, that's not fair either.
How do you think adding TBS into the mix changed his booking? If it did.
I
Because he didn't expect that, obviously, when he went to work there.
Well, but at the same time, it's like, wow, I didn't expect $1 million to fall onto my front porch today, but I'm not upset about it. I think it obviously enabled him to have more television time to do more different things. That's what I loved about what Dusty did from 80, especially in 86 through 88, was that he would, since he had 2 hours of syndicated television that Crockett did every week. That was our Tuesday night TV taping somewhere around Charlotte with the Nemo truck that then they'd drive back to Charlotte. They'd recorded everything live to tape. They'd roll the fucking, they'd do the dubs overnight. We'd go Wednesday and roll the local promos into them for Harrisburg, Pennsylvania or wherever, and they'd send them out by bus. That's how it worked in those days. But those shows were primarily to promote the local house shows. And that's why they contained the local promos. Now, they were on local broadcast television, but we had those in, 80 or 90 or 100 markets, even at that point, across the country. With TBS, he could just get the talent over, give them wins, whether it be squashes or occasionally something halfway competitive. He could give the guys just promos to talk about. Yes, that was the primary way of selling the Omni, but wrestling fans around the country already looked at the Omni as kind of like the Madison Square Garden of the NWA to begin with, so everybody expected that to be talked about. But at the same time, you could just talk about the people you were mad at and what you were going to do without having to get too specific about dates and places and smarten people up that this match was happening 25 times next month. The TBS was great ways to promote the Bash Tour, or as pay-per-views came along, or Starrcade, the big event that everybody across the country can see or be a part of, or travel to somewhere close to them. And TBS was also great for when he would do the one-off match. And I mean, he did them with a variety of people, but he did them with the Midnight a lot because I think he liked the way that I cut the promos and sold them. Why else would they advertise the Midnight Express defends the U.S. Tag Team title against Randy and Bill Mulkey in their hometown of Anderson, South Carolina? We had TV in fucking Greenville or Spartanburg, and we could have sold it out by just doing the promos there, but he promoted it on TBS because it fit into the story of Jimmy Crockett trying to fuck with us. And it was a way to do some entertaining shit and talk about a different match without giving, because that was the only place that one was going to happen. Never happened before or since. Or the 8-person tag with Misty Blue in Baltimore, where it was me and the Midnight and Murdoch against Dusty and I think it was Nikita and Wyndham and Misty Blue. We didn't do that. We just did it one place. We talked about it on TBS. It drew $100,000. He could do shit like that with TBS that made things bigger or gave you more time to flesh guys out. Whereas the syndicated TV was squash, interview at the set, go to the break, do the local promo, come back, do the same fucking thing.
A lot of people said, I can make money with Misty Blue. Dusty's the only one who did it.
The only one who ever did. That's the only 6-figure gate she ever main evented. I'll guarantee you that.
When do you think the TBS show became the #1 show for the promotion?
Well, it depends on what you determine the #1 show, because more people watched it than the syndicated TV probably overall, but more people in Charlotte, North Carolina or in Greensboro probably were watching the syndicated TV than were watching TBS because of not only the limited amount of cable penetration at that point, but also because that was their habit.
Right.
That was their, they'd had a habit for years of watching the local Crockett wrestling show on their local station to find out who was coming to the Coliseum or who was going to Greensboro, who was fucking whatever. So
yeah, Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling and Worldwide Wrestling still existed, although one of them had a different name. It was the same time slots, same TV stations.
right. And in Charlotte, North Carolina, which besides for Atlanta in the 80s was the second biggest market in the Southeast, Crockett's local wrestling program, the syndicated programs as we called them, I'm trying to think, in 1986, there were 5 broadcast TV stations in Charlotte, 3 networks and 2 strong independents, and Crockett had a show on 3 of them. They actually had to add a third show, which was, I think Tony Schiavone sat and hosted it in the fucking studio in front of a monitor. And it was a 30-minute show, Super Bouts or something like that, because the TV station wanted more fucking wrestling. So their ratings were immense in the local markets that they'd always had. But as they spread out, people in Albuquerque might not have picked up right away on watching Worldwide Wrestling on, KXBQ Channel 4 that's only been on there 3 months, but they've been watching TBS wrestling for years if they had cable. So it just depended on where you were.
What'd you think about when Dusty's wife said that when they moved to Charlotte, it was just a giant wasteland?
Well, I think and honestly, Charlotte has sprouted as a banking center and a major metropolis. And since I've been back, I hate it compared to the way it was in the 80s. It still kind of was like a small, green, tree-forested southern town. But Magnum may have said it best. It was like a bowl of oatmeal with no sugar, is kind of what he said, because before Dusty went there, remember, again, George Scott had only been gone for, about a year and a half at that point, or even that long. And George Scott's method of booking worked in the Carolinas, but was dry in terms of the entertainment value compared to what Dusty shot in. And they were used to the biggest stars in wrestling in the Carolinas, but they hadn't seen a lot of the wacky angles that Southern wrestling was known for. So Dusty brought the razzmatazz, and that was the third boost. They went from the regional territory to the fucking Cadillac territory to now it's my God, we're fucking selling out and running stadiums going national territory.
What do you think? Oh, go ahead.
Yeah.
Oh, we're going to keep doing this. We're going to keep both talking the same time.
And you.
What do you think a booker or a promoter could learn lesson-wise from Dusty? Because he was the booker, and he did some extraordinary things and had extraordinary growth in 86. But there was also, and it was going back to the beginning, the complaints about he made himself the central figure in everything. I remember, I think 84 Mid-Atlantic, Flair goes to Blackjack Mulligan's ranch at night where there's like a barbecue to find him and recruit him to be his tag team partner. And there's Dusty in the background. Just make sure he was seen on camera. What do you think about, how do you do it right? How do you do it wrong if you are your own top babyface star and also the booker?
Well, for one thing, still at that point in time, do you blame Schwarzenegger or Stallone for starring in their own movie? What bigger star is available to them? People can say, well, Ric Flair was a bigger star. Well, Ric Flair was Dusty's opponent, or the opponent that he had in mind. If they weren't working together, they were planning the next fucking run. There was nobody bigger that wasn't launched for Vince already at that point. Piper and Hogan, Dusty and Flair. So, yes, he had to put himself on top, and it drew money. The 87 downturn in business was not solely due to Dusty's booking, but it was due to a lot of the things that Dusty had to get involved in booking. It was as a result of those territories falling by the wayside and Crockett buying them, snatching them, taking talent. I'm not even talking about the UWF. And yes, I agree, they didn't do a good job with that. But the problem was UWF had no core territory business to support them, like Charlotte had a core territory business to support them. so they could have done a dueling blah, blah, blah. But if you're the booker, is it a bigger problem when you're one of the biggest stars in the business and you put yourself on top, or is it a bigger problem when you get 15 new fucking guys that you got to figure out what to fucking do with? And TBS didn't dilute Dusty's booking when they went from 2 hours of syndication in the Carolinas to 5 hours total because there was 3 hours of TBS. That was great. When they then went to, well, we got a couple hours of this Mid-South show, and by the way, we got TV from Florida, from that territory, and Kansas City. We just bought them. The Batten twins need to be doing something. Then it got ridiculously muddled. And then in the early part of 88, they just folded a lot of that shit up when they found out they were in money trouble, cash flow trouble. And if you'll notice, when they stopped doing so many of the regional television shoots and was diluted the schedule and blah, 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 and had the roster at least under some semblance of order, from March of 88 through the 88 bashes, he got the business back. The 88 bashes did good business, and then Flair and Luger rematches and Midnight Tully and Arn coming out of it were setting some records because they got bogged down in 87 with all those multiple TV tapings and influxes of territories and rosters, and it went shit for a while. But he got it back by the summer of 88, but it was too late because Crockett, who since before he passed away, ultimately took responsibility on himself. He didn't know where he was financially, and he bought a bill of goods as far as not only the syndicated television revenue that was coming in, but also getting blocked on pay-per-view when if they had just been able to be carried on those first two pay-per-views that Vince blocked, they would have eventually got the $2 million they were in the hole when they found out about it. But that never happened. Did I just drone on and put you to sleep?
No, you're giving great analysis here.
And another thing in the program, the biography program that I liked was they obviously gave him credit, as they should, for inventing war games or launching the Great American Bash Tour. And I told you this when we talked yesterday on the phone. They showed a page. They still have Dusty's 86 book. And I remember seeing that fucking book sitting in front of me on the plane with on Dusty's lap when he's writing in it on multiple occasions. And they showed the page from the bash at Charlotte Memorial Stadium, July the 5th. And when I've taught, if anybody recorded this program and wants to go back and freeze frame that point, when I've talked about bookers doing their booking book, Dusty did everything in shorthand and very little writing down. Just basically you would have a guy's first name or last name or initials, depending on what he called people. I was JC, or he would write Dusty T.A. Doll for the Dusty, Magnum, and Baby Doll, and an X in between the opponents. And, that's kind of it in his red, fucking yearly ledger book. But you saw the number 234,000 written slanted diagonally on the left-hand side. That was where he recorded the gate. It was $234,000, which in 1986, I don't have the inflation calculator in front of me, but stuff we've been doing research on, that'd be somewhere around, what, 650,000 maybe dollars in 2023 money, as they say. So he did closing in on a $750,000 gate at a stadium in Charlotte that was one of the shows of the week. And I loved seeing that book again and seeing the double main event. It's a double cage. RM versus Flair, WT, Ricky Morton versus Flair world title, and Dusty, TA, and Doll versus Midnight Express and JC. We were in a 6-person cage. And then they didn't pan down any further. I couldn't see from that. But
I remember the commercial Ric Flair used to do for the video. And Baby Doll looking so fine. Finally gets her hands on that Weasley little Jim Cornette.
And then they went into the Flair and Dusty rivalry and the back and forth promos where they juxtaposed the idea. And old cousin Dave there was valuable again here. Flair was the fucking rich, successful college football star, had the women and the nice cars, and Dusty was the son of the plumber that didn't dress nice and had a fat belly and everybody could identify with. And the way that they did it back and forth with the editing, but that was part for people. This was almost 40 years ago now. And to us, actually, even to me, you were just a young whippersnapper. But seeing the people and hearing the people talk about it and going to the arenas every night, that was a great encapsulation of the way that the average fans, not the smart fans of the day who despised Dusty because he was fat and didn't do a great crossbody, all 1,400 of those people in the United States at that point in time. But that was the way that the fans thought of both of them at that point. And Magnum had a great quote. He said that Dusty could depict violence that's not common today. When the angles that they did, that he came up with, he wanted everything to have the maximum impact. If it was supposed to be funny, he wanted to be funny as possible without exposing the business. But if he wanted it to be violent, he wanted the people to believe that it was as violent as possible. And that's when everybody went the extra mile. When they broke his leg in Atlanta, everybody carried him out of the ring. And they showed footage of him on Crockett's plane with the fucking ice bag on his leg, screaming in pain. There's Magnum. And, old Dave said this felt like, and we said, these have been your words, but Dave said this felt like adults were fighting over big issues. It was like a reality series where they actually did fight. And Dustin told a story. He kayfabed the kids on the broken leg. And then, because Dustin would have been what? Goddamn 15, 16 that year, maybe. Dustin saw the cast in the closet with the fucking slit up the side where Dusty could put it on and take it off. And he's like, a motherfucker. But that's, that was common in those days in the business. You didn't, because your kids are going to go to school and talk. And then the Hard Times promo.
Which has taken on a life of its own, because I never heard about that promo until 2004 or so. And now it's become like the greatest and a lot of people talk about it like it's the greatest promo of all time. It's just no one paid attention to it for 20 years.
Well, remember, I've said before on Wednesdays, promo day at Crockett's office, when the big town would come up and Dusty would be needed, Gene Anderson would go in and get him, and he'd walk in from his office where he's working in his book. And okay, boom, count him down, and he'd do a 2-minute local promo for Philadelphia that was almost that good, and in one take, and then walk back to his fucking office. It has taken on a life of its own, and it's a great one. But I kind of, what was it, 5 or 6 years, depending on the time of the season. Before that was the Payback is Hell Daddy promo. And I got to be honest, as a fan, even as a photographer, I didn't get to see Dusty in his element in Florida. I saw him in 77 the first time live when he was on Jarrett's first show at the Coliseum. But it was Dusty Rhodes and Tommy Gilbert against Phil Hickerson and Dennis Condrey for the Southern Tag Team title. I was smart enough at that point to know that Phil and Dennis were not going to lose the belts because Dusty was probably not coming back. But just seeing him come in cold, it was harder to get than when you saw a steady diet of him. And this was before I was able to, finally I could see TBS about that same year also. When my uncle down in East Tennessee, they got cable because they couldn't get real TV stations any other way. And then you started seeing the promos, and then you got the whole picture of him. But when tape started going around and you could see the angles, you could see the whole 9 yards, and the turn in 80 which I was there for, and then got to see the Payback is Hell Daddy promo. That's when I really started getting done. I said, there's nothing else going on like this. And Ole played his part perfectly, but fucking Dusty, my God, and the way that he built that thing, everybody just go and YouTube it. What would it be under on YouTube? The 1980 Omni turn?
The big turn of 1980, I think, was what it was the last time I looked.
Okay. But anyway, that's where you can see he's drawing these people in. He's a fucking preacher. He's a motivator. He could, if he'd had the desire, he probably could have got elected to politics, especially these days, because you believed him. So anyway, then at that point, then we get into the part of his life where he got two younger kids, and now Dustin's wanting to get into business, but Cody's come along, and Teal. And again, they showed the footage of Dusty beating Flair in Greensboro on the 86 Bash show. And that you could see heads in the top row of the Coliseum there. That place was jammed that night. I was on the card. And I found it interesting that the way they phrased it, finally, after years of trying, Dusty beats Flair. And Cody immediately said, all those previous times, those weren't losses. That was the chase. And I'm starting to think now, is this what Cody is setting us up for? That, I got beat by Roman the first time. I'll probably get beat by Roman again. Does he think that the chase is going to be as valuable to him as it was to Dusty before he finally gets that thing?
Well, it's not like Cody's responsible for the booking up there. I mean, he can have suggestions, but
what if he pitched it ahead of time? Yeah, I want you to beat me 5 times in a row before I win it. You think they're going to turn that down? I'm just saying, maybe that's part of the idea, because we'll talk about Raw and Cody's promo later on.
But not everyone can do what Dusty did. Like, Dusty was a very special chaser, I guess we could say.
Yeah.
Dusty, I guess you could say Jerry Lawler, Tommy Rich at one point to an extent, but there's the problem with sometimes the chase just ending and then everything kind of changes. But because Cody's such a big part of this documentary, let's tie him into this a little bit. They start the documentary with Cody at WrestleMania hiding because it was a surprise appearance. That's how they tie it up at the end of the documentary. Right. Seeing this documentary, what do you think now of the finish at WrestleMania?
Well, that's why I brought that up with Cody making a special point of the chase, but also after, which I don't want to jump ahead to the Raw review, but I changed my mind potentially more on the WrestleMania finish because of the promo that Cody did rather than because of this program. But at the same time, my reaction to the Raw promo that Cody did was almost like, my God, he might be able to pull this off and not lose anybody verbally. But we're jumping ahead. When Dusty, obviously, they glossed over the controversy that led to TBS firing Dusty as Booker, and then Dusty, because remember, they fired him as the Booker, but he was still there as a talent for a couple of weeks, which is very, very difficult, especially to the level that Dusty, it was like all of a sudden, our friend Cecil B. DeMille becomes a member of the chorus line. And that wasn't going to work. And, he left shortly thereafter. They glossed over that whole part. And
well, can you go into that a little bit about the whole, why he did the Spike angle after he should have seemingly known that would have been a problem?
Well, I don't know. Otherwise,
the Spike angle being the Road Warriors stabbing him in the eye with a spike.
Well, we'll talk about the details, but I don't know that he would have done it if he thought it was going to be that big of a fucking deal. But at the same time, he might have done it because, what the fuck, nobody at TBS was impressing anybody that they knew anything about wrestling, and he wanted to fucking get the goddamn business back up. We had gotten hot, and then Tully and Arn left, and the bottom fell out of that. And then the sale came, and he wanted to heat things up. So the Road Warriors turning heel by beating up the Midnight Express in unsavory fashion and winning the World Tag Team title, and then going on TBS and trying to gouge Dusty's eye out with a spike was supposed to get a lot of heat on the Road Warriors and heat up the next, big program. And what it did was get heat on Dusty with the TBS management, and the people didn't want to boo the Road Warriors. There was a small smattering of booing, but the Warriors were too over at that point. And since I had already bled several pints on TBS about a month before that, and they had said, don't have any more blood. Well, Dusty, he didn't get a ton of blood, but it was the idea of the spike in the eye. Because we were then later on, you remember when Flair became the booker, and we got the memo about the don't put the plastic bag over the fucking guy's head anymore.
Well, that one is a bit more egregious than a spike in the eye, if I say so.
I'd rather have a plastic bag over my head than a spike in my fucking eye, fella. I don't know about you, but
Terry Funk tried to murder Ric Flair on TV.
Well, got some fucking heat. We loved it.
You just said something. Were you told that the angle with the original Midnight Express was the specific reason for the no more blood on TV rule?
No, but it apparently it brought it to their attention, because I don't think that TBS knew that occasionally there was really blood. Nobody in the new ownership or whatever. I mean, the camera people knew, the director knew, but suddenly it was like, well, they said we can't have blood anymore. Why? Well, I was the last one to bleed. Maybe they just noticed it. And the first
that was
time
also
I
the
ever
first
bled
time.
Yes, first time I ever bled on television in my life. But God damn it, they remembered it. Anyway, so that was and then of course during the sale process, when TBS was talking to a lot of the top talent, they did talk to the Horsemen. We didn't make the cut on the interviews for talking to the top talent, but Tully had pretty much buried Dusty's booking in these supposedly secret confidential talks that they had with the talent. We're not going to say anything, but what do you think? And then Dusty immediately heard everything that Tully had said. And so then Dusty banned Tully off Crockett's plane. Fuck him, he can fly commercial. And then that's when, I guess we were in Houston the night before, went to Philadelphia. Arn and Tully came in. Both of them had a couple of beverages and announced they were fucking giving their notice and they were going to the WWF. They dropped the belts to us. So that was, and then a couple months later, that shit happened. But anyway, refresh me now. Didn't he go back to Florida and tried to open up an office in Florida before he did go to work for Vince?
He did, the PWF, and there was some good stuff there. He feuded with Terry Funk. Before Terry Funk came back to the NWA, it was the NWA. The NWA in 1989, he returned to Florida to feud with Dusty Rhodes. And then he also did stuff with Dustin. So, I mean, that was one of the first things that put Dustin on the map. It wasn't really Memphis. It was him and Terry Funk in 89. Dusty won the tournament to be the champion. I think he beat the Big Steel Man, who was his brother-in-law.
Yeah.
They had the
Shockmaster.
They had the Nasty Boys. They had, I think, Scott Hall, Steve Kern. Whoever was in Florida with Gordon Soley, Mike Graham, and the biggest star there was, Dusty Rhodes. And, I think the first night, the big show with Dusty did well. And then after that, the problems that were hitting wrestling everywhere hit Florida.
Yeah. Well, at that point, you needed money, and they had plenty of talent, but they didn't have a huge amount of money nor a strong television. And think about over the previous 4 years, Eddie Graham had killed himself January of 85. And then by 87, Crockett had taken over. The whole roster had changed and then pretty much ceased to exist, and the Florida town stopped getting run on a regular basis. And then all of a sudden, for 6 months or less, Dusty gets TV at a few places and tries to come back, but it was, it would have taken a massive amount of rebuilding, as I would find out later on in Knoxville. So,
and then Gordon Soley went back to the NWA. Funny
yeah.
enough.
And so at that point, Dusty, and the one thing, Bruce just chapped my ass on this. He's got to be in there and be the company rah-rah guy. Well, see, Dusty and those guys just didn't realize there was a whole world outside of their area that didn't know that Jim Crockett Promotions existed. Well, there was a lot of fucking people in Greensboro, Bruce, that wouldn't have come to a fucking WWF house show that year at gunpoint. So things work both ways. But the problem became when Dusty goes to the WWF, he's now in his late 40s. And he's a guy who, as Magnum TA said, could depict violence that's not common today. And the WWF didn't sell violence at all. They did. And Dusty had to change. He had to do it differently because Dusty Rhodes, the American Dream, the thing that they actually admitted, even Dave and a bunch of the boys acknowledged the polka dots was bullshit and rotten and disrespectful, except for Bruce, who gave the same explanation for it he always does.
He gave away his mindset where he talked about the differences. Like, you're in these territories and everything seems like a big thing, and then you go to New York. And you realize this is really what it is. And that's when all of a sudden he sold his soul and just repeats whatever he thinks they want to hear.
But that was the thing with, even if Dusty had come in to the WWF as the American Dream with the jeans and the cowboy boots and the whole thing, it was too late for him to start fresh and have that body of work behind him to a different audience. Yes, a lot of them were different. And the same guy that got over in 1970-something in Florida could have got over, and that got over in New York in 1977, could have got over in 1989 if he'd have been the same guy. But he didn't have that body of work behind him, and he didn't have the youth to recreate it. He could still talk, but he couldn't do it, and it was a completely different style. You couldn't fucking hang people and cut people's heads off and run into them with cars, not till the Attitude Era. In that period of time in the WWF, you had to dance with poor fucking Sapphire and wear polka dots because it was ice cream bars.
Well, if I could say a couple things. One, it would have been nice for Hulk Hogan to speak up. You hear him in this documentary. It's like, I didn't know why Vince did that. I thought he should have been the American Dream, Dusty Rhodes, and doing, well, you should have said that, champ.
Yeah.
But secondly, they did bring him in like that, kind of. That was my first exposure to Dusty Rhodes. Remember I told you my dad's friend used to talk about seeing him in the garden? This is when it first came up when I was 9 years old, first watching WWF wrestling, and Dusty Rhodes was going to fix some woman's toilet. And the next week, he was picking up their garbage. I guess in Vince's eyes, to be the American Dream, you have to do every job that Vince would never want to do.
Well, remember, I'm the common man. That was to Vince what being the hero of the working class was. Well, he's got to be a fucking turd pumper or a shit carrier or a fucking ditch digger or whatever. But Dusty turned it around and threw it back at him and was so fucking over the top with the shit that they had him do, and then still knew how to get heat from the people in the live matches. That, he made it work for a while, but
they didn't bring him in with the polka. My point was, they brought him in his first few appearances, tie-dyed shirt. I think he wore jeans a few times, wore trunks without polka dots. It's like they added that after he was already starting to get over. And then they just forced that. That's the thing I think a lot of people miss in the story. It wasn't like he came in and they put polka dots on him right away. No, there's a good month and a half.
Yeah.
No polka dots, and it was starting to work. And then polka dots, and it worked as well as it could with Sapphire and polka dots.
He needs polka dots.
Yeah, Dusty Rhodes and Minnie Mouse. Name anyone else famous with polka dots.
Little Dot.
Well, there you go.
Anyway, so he was there for what they said about a year and a half, and then went back to WCW, and that's when he got the the booking job there. Was that right as Hurd was leaving or right after Hurd had
No,
left?
no, Hurd was still there. The way it worked, and Dusty said it was very interesting hearing his own words in this. I was getting a little fed up with the polka dots by the end, because by the end he stopped wearing the polka dots. I don't know if that was his choice or if they told him he could, but the stuff with him and Dustin there was really interesting and really good, and a nice departure from everything else he had done against DiBiase and Virgil. And as a fan, I was disappointed that he finished up at the Royal Rumble, because that was it. That was the end of the Dustin and Dusty story in WWF. It went like 2 months. And then he showed up. He was already booking. He first showed up officially in January of 91, but I believe he was already booking. They hired him as booker before he was done with WWF. So he was already booking towards the end of 1990, which probably would have been around when
No, he wasn't. Because remember, we left at Halloween 1990, and he wasn't back yet.
I think December is when they made the deal with Dusty. And then he finished up January at the Royal Rumble.
All right, champ.
But then he came back in 91, and Jim Herd was there in charge for a while longer.
Yeah, and then Herd left, and then actually...
Because that's when you met with him, and he tried to get you.
That's when I met with him, and he said, don't worry, you won't ever have to see Herd. I said, I know I won't, because I'm not coming. But yeah, so you're right. Herd was still there for a little while. And, again, Dusty had people's loyalty that he had booked in the past and he had made stars out of and made a lot of money for. And if it hadn't been for Jim Herd still being there, and actually, even if Herd had been there, I bought it with Watts because they gave him briefly the alleged top job in the company. He was allegedly the final boss. And that's why I went back then. I would have gone to work for Dusty had Dusty been and I even told him that at that Super Brawl pay-per-view. Remember when Watts was 93. Already gone at that point, Super Brawl 93.
Asheville.
And we walked in the locker room, and one of the guys, we'd made a few TV, tapings, but I think one of the referees, I can't remember it. I'm not even going to say who it was, but one of them said, hey, good to see you guys back. And I said something like, well, look quick because this is the last time you're going to see us. And then about 15 minutes later, Dusty came in. Can I talk to you, kid? Yes. Have we got heat? What are you talking about? Well, I heard you tell somebody you weren't going to be back. I said, well, Dusty, I'm not. I said, Ole was nominally the new booker, I think, at that point, and Dusty was the vice president of something or other. But I said, or maybe it was vice versa. Maybe Dusty was the booker, then they made Ole the vice president of something or other. It was always changing. And I said, Dusty, if it was you, I'd work for you anytime. But it's not you, and nobody's ever going to have, that I trust, is ever going to have the pull to be the person that makes decisions, as I've seen from working with Bill Watts here. Suddenly he's gone before we just almost even got started. So, but it wasn't, it wasn't I didn't want to work for Dusty. I didn't want to work for TBS and whoever the fuck they were going to put in charge of Dusty. Anyway, but then they went into the stuff that Dustin and Dusty did in WCW briefly, and then talked about the estrangement that Dusty and Dustin went through, and Dustin became Goldust, and the issues with Terry and a lot of people knew that the marriage was most of the issues between Dustin and his dad at that point, but finally they reunited. I thought, and I'm not saying he was against it, but they gave Dusty credit for Ron Simmons becoming the first black WCW champion. Watts was the VP then.
Well, Dusty was booking. I mean, that's one of the things.
Dusty was booking. That's why I'm saying he wasn't against it. But again, when the story came out, it was Watts was pushing for it because he wanted to recreate JYD. That was a group effort.
The story Watts always told is that when they brought him in 92, one of the first things they told him to do was fire Dusty, and he didn't want to do that. I mean, he was one of the first people to recognize Dusty's mind, probably. And he brought Dusty in the room, and he said, they want me to fire you. Do you think you're going to have any problem working for me? And Dusty said no. and he didn't get fired. But it's interesting. They didn't think they'd be able to work together or coexist. Dusty be able to work under a Bill Watts.
Well, it was the same thing that Watts said later on to Vince when he had that little run up there for a while and then he quit and went back home. He said, Vince, there's only room for one Titan in Titan Sports. And I think Watts knew from his experience running his company how Dusty probably would have felt most any other time, may still have felt then, but wanted the job or whatever, that he'd been the guy for a while. So it was his deal. And who's going to be the Titan in Titan Sports? Who's going to be the top guy of the world in World Championship Wrestling? So, but then Dusty said, I don't have a problem, Bill, because Watts had predated Dusty in the business. That's one thing Dusty could look up to Watts as having been a booker and owning part of the office when Dusty was breaking in.
Watts was the booker when Dusty turned in 74.
Yes. And plus he had worked McGurk's territory with Murdoch in the early 70s. So, you know, at least Dusty could look up to somebody like that. I think if they'd have brought John Laurinaitis in and said, hey, Dusty, the kid that used to carry the fucking sheep herder's flagpole, can you work under him? I'm sure he would have said, yeah, fucking right. It's in my ass, motherfucker. Anyway, so then they glossed over when WCW went under, basically, and Dusty worked a bit. He was out of there beforehand because he worked ECW and he worked the Indies. That was a several-year period that was kind of glossed over in about 30 seconds, but it wasn't that newsworthy. The point was that they did make the case that the finances were getting bad and Dusty needed a job. And, you know, at that point, I guess he's in his early 60s. And what was the quote that he told one of the boys? The boys told me down in Florida. He was sitting there one day in NXT or still when it was FCW or whatever. He said, boy, Vince McMahon better be glad I didn't save my money. Or he was having one of those headache days. He was like, I wouldn't be here if I'd have saved my money. But he loved it. He loved the business. And they went to the Hall of Fame induction and him becoming a trainer, teacher, coach, mentor. And then the clip of all three of the Rhodes family together in the WWE in 2013 was that Stephanie was sitting there putting it over. Oh, it was so great. We had this opportunity.
Yeah, she's the one who ruined it.
Yes, wasn't it her that got pissed at Dusty and took him off TV, cut it off?
This was so good. This was the best thing Cody ever did up until, the last few years. They reunite Dustin or Goldust and Cody with Dusty, and they come out there. And there's 1 week where it's Dusty with his kids squaring off with Stephanie in the ring. And no, I think he was talking maybe Triple H, but Stephanie's behind him and he puts his hand over her face.
Yeah, she started to interrupt him while he was on a roll and he put the hand out and like, shh.
And the crowd loved it. And it was a cool moment. I mean, it stood out and I still remember it. And Stephanie didn't forget it either. She immediately canceled any other times that Dusty would ever talk on TV ever again. I mean, that's the way I remember it. I don't know.
So, and Cody he said one thing. He said Dusty didn't like being on television at that point. He didn't want people to remember him as a fat old man and kind of choked up at it.
He was awesome. I loved that run right there where for a limited period of time, Dusty was involved. It was actually really good.
But see, when they showed the footage, yes, Dusty, as he aged and got in his 60s and he had never been the body beautiful, he wasn't the most appealing looking guy, but he still had the movement and the people still knew, and he still knew how to fucking work. And you saw when he hit, it was fucking Plumber Moxley with the bionic elbow. And then he's got his belt off and he's kind of twirling it, whipping it at him like he's menacing him and the people are out of their seats. It was still fucking Dusty. And at that point, I thought, you know what? He was wrestling's Jackie Gleason, the great one. He had an outsized personality. He was athletic, even though his physique defied that to look at him. He did everything. He excelled at everything. Jackie Gleason was a television star, a movie star, a composer, a comedian, he did everything. The great one. Well, Dusty was everything, and didn't.
And they both lost the Harley race.
And they both lost to Harley Race. And Dusty, as a matter of fact, and Dusty always talked about when they ran the Miami Beach Convention Center in Florida that he would go and sneak in and take a shit on Jackie Gleason's toilet in his. But I mean, he was wrestling's Jackie Gleason. Everything he did, it was broad and it was over the top and it all worked.
Well, you heard it here, folks. Magnum TA Wrestling's Ed Norton.
Norton, how would you? Well, nevertheless. So then, at the end of the program, obviously, and it was 2015. And Dusty never went to the doctor. He was a person that didn't like doctors, and Michelle said that he thought if he didn't go to the doctor, he wouldn't be sick. And he started losing weight, and I remember, I guess it wasn't but a few months before he died. Magnum talked about in this program seeing Dusty so much lighter, like 70 pounds lighter than he knew him as. And I had been talking on the phone to J.J. Dillon. And J.J., I guess, was at the same show because he had said, wow, Dusty, I hope he's feeling okay. He was significantly lighter. And at the time I had said, well, maybe, because he's almost 70 now, or if he's not over 70, whatever he was, I said, he's always been overweight. Maybe he's doing that now preemptively to be in better health. We can think about that. Obviously, that was not what he was doing. And I still had never really heard all the details that Michelle and the rest of the family gave in this, but he collapsed at home. He went to the hospital. They found out he had a liver infection. And 30 hours after she called the ambulance, he was gone. I didn't know that took place that quickly, that suddenly.
And it was really heartbreaking hearing his oldest daughter, who I thought was great throughout this documentary, talking about, she was on the way there. She just missed.
Yeah.
And he sat up and had that last moment with Cody and Dustin. But the family really were the stars of this, I think. They all did a great job.
Yeah. And that's why I think it was the best one they've done overall, because it was a guy it was footage that you haven't seen done to death over and over. If you've seen it at all, you're as old as me and or a tape collector like Brian. And just what a personality. And that's the way you used to be able to get in the wrestling business and be the biggest star and get involved in the office and blah, blah, blah. You could work your way up and you could make yourself that level of attraction. And it's not possible anymore. But nobody's got that personality anyway. And I know people. And again, there's reason for knocking some of Dusty's booking when he got too comfortable, or he wasn't a detail guy. And, it was all about the big stuff. Yes, he had weak spots in things that you look back and say, well, he shouldn't have done that. He was too confident and everything or whatever. But who else ever? No wrestling company against Vince McMahon ever until the late 90s during WCW's accidental fucking, challenge period ever was really neck and neck in any way with Vince McMahon. And no wrestling company until that late 90s Attitude Era, besides the WWF, ever grossed the money that Crockett Promotions did in 1986. So if he wasn't, the absolute best, he outperformed the other guys that were better.
What'd you think of his brother saying that he never heard anyone in the family ever call him Virgil?
Well, everybody's known that along. Nobody ever called him Virgil.
I thought at least the family, you think that. I didn't realize even the brother said that. I've never heard him called Virgil by anyone.
I never heard, well, his kids and or, any close friend I was ever around in his presence or anybody. I've never heard anybody call him. And the only reason that it was a rib when they had credits on the TBS program that they would roll at the end, and he put his name up as producer, Virgil Runnels Jr., because only the smart fans then, who were a microscopic, part of the overall audience, knew what Dusty Rhodes' name really was.
And then when Ted DiBiase shows up with a servant, Vince McMahon, because it was never a rib, decides to name the servant Virgil.
Yes.
After his prime competitor.
It was never a rib. And then they did, again, some incredible highlights to close the thing. And it ended with Cody's return at WrestleMania and Dustin in his wrestling school and the families together. And I thought that was nice. But yeah, I owe Dusty a ton for what he did for me and for the Midnight. And a lot of people do, because he didn't have to push us like he did. He gave us a tremendous fucking push at the start of our run and through the whole thing with the rock and roll. And yes, he got tremendous returns out of it, but he worked with us when Dennis left. The Midnight Express and Cornette's a valuable commodity. We're going to let him have a replacement. And we were his go-to guys when he needed somebody to do something. He knew we could get it done. He'd stick us in it. And we were nothing but successful with Dusty.
Well, there it is, the A&E biography of the American Dream, Dusty Rhodes. Definitely one worth going out of your way to see. A great job they did. It could have been twice as long and I would have been intrigued by it. Like, we're talking about all these different things they left out. What a great story. Well, Jim, transitioning from the Dusty Rhodes biography to more wrestling talk. We're going to talk about WWE Raw in a moment. And that really isn't a happy thought, going from memories of the era of the American Dream to whatever it is that is happening on Monday nights.
From the American Dream to the current television viewer's nightmare.
Well, perhaps it's your nightmare, or perhaps you have actual issues or problems that you need someone to talk with about. And when you're done butchering the English language, Jim will tell you exactly where you can go.
Yes, great transition. If you have nightmares and wake up screaming and having the sheets soaked with sweat, ladies and gentlemen, perhaps you need somebody to talk to and share some of this. And now that we've made enough light of that, especially with how we started the program today, mental health is a serious issue, not only in this country, but around the world, but especially in the United States because of contributory factors. And it doesn't seem like that a lot of people are paying attention to trying to better access for people that need it to mental health services. And you'll get to run around in a lot of cases if you try to find anybody locally or in person or in your area, or if the insurance covers it or don't, because we all know about the insurance situation in the United States. Nevertheless, if you need someone to talk to, if you've been thinking of trying therapy, but you can't, for whatever reason, find someone in your area or someone that fits or someone that you can afford, we encourage you to give BetterHelp a try. Obviously, this show is sponsored by BetterHelp, as are many of our programs. And we have done that because so many of the Cult of Cornette listeners have given us feedback that they were able to help themselves with the process. BetterHelp is a online therapy situation where you don't need to go anywhere in person. You don't need to talk to anybody in person. You can go online, you take a slight quiz, and you find out who might be a good matchup for you. They have licensed therapists that you can change at any point until you find one you like. But it's, as I said, entirely online and designed to be convenient and flexible, and you can work it around your schedule. So, as we mentioned, all you got to do is go to BetterHelp, HELP, betterhelp.com/JCE Fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a therapist, and you'll get 10% off your first month's services by going to betterhelp.com/JCE. 10% off your first month's services. So if you've been thinking of giving therapy a try, this would be a way to dip your toe in the water and potentially run some things by someone else that's affecting your decision-making process. And you get the 10% off, so you can't beat that with a stick. You know what they say, Brian? It's like a sore dick or a busted drum. You can't beat it.
No one says that.
Nobody?
Did Mama Cornette ever say that?
She actually never used to say that.
No one else says that either.
Well, then forget I said it.
Maybe you could use someone to talk to. BetterHelp.com/
.com/JCE.